How is it that being willing to become vulnerable to our deepest and darkest fears brings with it the very power that we're looking for? And why is this such an important part of the healing process and the maturation process of an individual? The channel is Meditation Amsterdam. My name is Pablo, and today I get to make the 5th video on the review of The Pearl Beyond Price, the book by A.H. Almaas. If you haven't seen the previous 4, it's nice to see them in sequence. There's a playlist called The Pearl Beyond Price in the channel. And in this video, I want to talk about a crucial element that Almaas explains about the relationship between what he calls the personal essence, so the essence of our being, versus the ego identity, and what is the link between those two. How do we move from ego to essence or to real self? What is the rite of passage there? Now, in many previous videos, I've mentioned that the rite of passage is to a great degree to do with our willingness to feel our vulnerability and sense of lack. And Almaas goes into a lot of detail explaining how and why that is the case. And so I'm going to read a couple of passages from the book, a couple of brief quotes, and then after that I get to elaborate a little bit more on the whole topic. So he's explaining how to what the relationship is between personal essence, or the essence of being, and ego. And he says that we can hint at this relationship in analyzing the process through which students come upon the experience of the personal essence. As we have seen in our case histories, disidentifying with an ego structure often exposes a sense of deficiency, lack, or weakness, which is sometimes experienced as an emptiness, or more specifically, an empty hole. Allowing to understand the deficient emptiness precipitates the emergence of the personal essence in consciousness. And then he continues to say, the most important step for our discussion here, and in fact the most crucial in the whole process, this is important, is that of moving from identification with part of the ego structure to the state of deficiency. It's clear in all these cases that we have given, as well as in the rest of our experience with student, that this identification, although it gives a sense of identity, is also used for defense purpose. It functions partially, in fact, primarily to ward off, cover up deficiency and its painful effects. Okay? So the essence of what's being said here is that, if you remember, or if you have watched some of the previous videos, the ego, apart from giving us an identity and apart from giving us a vehicle with which we can operate in the world, it does these good things at a huge cost, which is the cost of living with an identity that is primarily defensive in nature. So the ego is born as a defense away from unwanted affects in the body, especially, right? As a vehicle with which we can procure comfort and security from an environment that is otherwise completely hostile to us. And what Almaas is explaining here is that to the degree that we are identified with our ego, to that same degree we will primarily have an identity that is defensive in nature. And so long as this is the case, we will also not use the ego for its positive things only, but we will also be subject to the negative part of the ego. In other words, identification with ego makes us primarily defensive. When we are not identified with the ego, then we can use the ego as a vehicle and a tool. And it's this identification that creates the main problem. So the ego as such is then a fairly good tool if used as a tool. And so how do we stop being identified with the ego? And this is where things get a little bit hairy, because to stop our identification with ego, we need to expose what the ego is hiding. And what it's hiding is a sense of lack and deficiency. Lack of what? Lack of the capacity to face it. Deficiency of what? Deficiency of the abilities, the strength, or the capacity to establish contact with and engage with whatever it is that we feel unprepared for. So the ego as a defense mechanism is a kind of obscuring layer on top of our insecurities. And in order to disidentify from the ego, we need to set those egoic defenses aside and allow for the vulnerability to be laid bare and be willing to feel that state of lack and deficiency, which, as Almaas explains, sometimes can be felt as a kind of void or an empty hole where power should sit. Now, it's a void and an emptiness because it's a part of us that is empty of what? It's empty of awareness. In other words, it's unattended. It's just there, unrecognized, unfelt. And it holds within it the very capacities that we feel that we lack. But because we are unwilling to feel it, we are using the ego as a defense against feeling part of ourselves. Unless we set the ego aside for a moment and we allow ourselves to feel the pain and vulnerability that is hiding behind our egoic defenses, then we will always be identified with the egoic structure that is in front of it. We will always be identified with those defense mechanisms, making our primary identity a defensive one, as opposed to a productive, open, and creative one. So that's the main gist of this video. And to recap, it has to do with the fact that our real being, which Almaas calls the personal essence, and our ego are relating to one another through the obscuration of vulnerability and insecurity. When we obscure insecurity with our ego and we are identified with, therefore, with our ego, we are primarily feeling defensive, even though we may not notice it. And when we lay that vulnerability to bear, we allow ourselves to feel it, to feel the void of power, to feel the sense of lack, then we, in feeling that, disentangle ourselves and disidentify ourselves from the egoic structures that had grown in order to protect and obscure that. And we are therefore freed from them. So that's the essence of this passage, which is one of the most highlighted ones that I have in the book, among the many, many good teachings that Almaas has to share with us. I'm very curious about your take on this one, so do share it in the comment section. And as usual, if you feel that these videos can be beneficial to others, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing make the channel far more visible and available. Very motivating to me. And I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Till then, cheerio. Bye-bye.